Some Senate Republicans see skinny repeal as such bad policy that they want assurances that it will only be used as a vehicle for negotiations with House Republicans. They're worried that those House Republicans will instead just turn around, pass it, and send it to the president's desk. And as we know, Errol, he has indicated that he is standing there pen in hand, ready to sign anything.
Now, Nancy, I'm just wondering if Senators Graham, McCain, and Johnson essentially killed Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's plan here.
Not necessarily. They made it very clear that they think it's a bad piece of legislation. However, they didn't come right out and say they would vote against it. What they want instead is a promise that if they vote for it, that it will never become law, that it's just going to be sort of a placeholder, if you will, so that they can get to what's known as a conference between the House bill and the Senate bill, and they could add new things in at that point, and skinny repeal would never see the light of day. The problem with that, however, is there's really no way that anyone can give them that kind of assurance. Even if House Republicans make that promise today, there's nothing to stop them from changing their minds tomorrow or a month from now if they can't come up with some kind of common plan that both the House and the Senate can support. And after all, everything about this process so far has not gone as planned. So who's to say that this piece of legislation would end up in the wastebasket the way that these Senate Republicans seem to want it to?
And just stepping back for a moment, Nancy, if you're, your typical American just watching this all play out in Washington, knowing that Republicans are trying to pass legislation they hope doesn't become law because it's the only thing they can agree on to get closer to a years-long promise and pledge to repeal and replace Obamacare, what does it tell you that this is close as Republicans can get to delivering on their #1 promise?
It tells you, first of all, that this is an incredibly haphazard slapdash process. I mean, Republicans met for lunch on Thursday, and they were still working to craft a bill that they want to vote on Friday. It's essentially a process of leaders saying, well, can you live with this? Can you live with that? What about this? Can I put this in? Can I take that out? And obviously, whatever they come up with, there will be no time to do any kind of analysis to determine what kind of impact it will truly have on the nation's healthcare system if it is ever to become law. That is not typically the way that you craft legislation here on Capitol Hill, especially when you're dealing with something as important as healthcare. But what it also shows is something that former House Speaker John Boehner pointed out in an interview that he did at a conference in Las Vegas last week. He said, look, I don't like Obamacare, but it is too late for my party to try to repeal it. They're not going to be able to do it because people have just gotten too used to a lot of the features of Obamacare at this point, and it is almost impossible to sort of cherry pick parts you want to take out and parts you want to leave in. And he predicted that it's just going to be too difficult for his party to find consensus on a plan that makes sense. And that's basically what we're seeing playing out in real time on the floor of the U.S. Senate right now.
And Nancy, it also appears that President Trump's political capital is running low. He cannot seem to get his party to pass major legislation despite having both chambers of Congress. He also tried to implement a ban via Twitter on those who are transgender serving in the military. You had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs come out and say there will be no modification to the transgender policy, and Senators John McCain and Orrin Hatch also lending their voices of criticism to what the president proposed. What else are you hearing about the views there on Capitol Hill of the president's leading via tweet?
It's hard to say that he has no influence on these senators. I was actually surprised to see that some of these moderate Republicans who had said before the voting started, I absolutely can't support a plan like this, actually actually vote to allow debate to go forward. Shelley Moore Capito, for instance, said, I don't mind being the one person who kills my party's health care plan if I think that it isn't good for the people of my state. But then, lo and behold, she voted to start debate, and the process is ongoing. And we've seen a number of instances like that. Dean Heller of Nevada, who had indicated that he was against a lot of this, but still voted to let the process go forward. So it is possible that the president calling them out by name, pressuring them in a variety of ways, is getting to them and is leading some of these Republicans to heed the words of Republican leaders when they say, hey, look, just vote for this next step to allow us to continue the process. And that's kind of the pattern that they're stuck in right now, is that there are Republicans who have a lot of misgivings about where this policy is headed, but their leadership is successfully arguing to them, well, if you just vote yes now, then we will get to a point where we can improve the policy. The problem is that at some point, those opportunities run out, and you realize that you are stuck with something you really don't like, and yet at the same time feel very uncomfortable at the bottom of the ninth saying, I'm going to vote against it, and really dashing your party's hopes. And so these moderate Republicans and some conservative Republicans, you can see that they're struggling with this dilemma right now. Do I vote no and essentially kill this process and force Republican leaders to go back to the drawing board with Democrats? And am I willing to take the heat for being the reason that my party was not able to fulfill a 7-year-long promise to repeal and replace Obamacare?
Now, the Senate did agree on one thing Thursday, overwhelmingly voting 98-2 to pass new sanctions against Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Russia specifically for meddling in the 2016 election. Right. The White House has sent mixed signals on if President Trump will sign this bill. What happens now?
The White House has really been all over the map on this. I mean, obviously, the president has gone back and forth multiple times about whether he thinks that Russia really did meddle in the U.S. election. And even his aides and advisors have given different stories about what he plans to do when it comes to these sanctions. On Sunday, you had the White House press secretary, Sarah Huckabee, saying the White House supports this new sanctions legislation. And then you had the director of communications, Anthony Scaramucci, saying the president is still deciding. Now, Scaramucci went back on that. He said he was still getting up to speed and that actually Sarah Huckabee Sanders was correct. But then, Errol, just this morning in a TV interview, he said maybe the president is going to reject these sanctions. Maybe he wants to put together tougher sanctions, which is a little bit hard to believe because this is the same president who was actually asking for more flexibility to get rid of these sanctions if he thought that they were not serving the nation's interest. So we're still not clear how the president is going to respond now that this legislation is headed to his desk. But the reality is that it doesn't matter because this legislation passed so overwhelmingly here in the Senate, as you pointed out, 98-2, over in the House earlier this week, 419-3, that if he vetoes the legislation, they need a 2/3 majority to override that veto, and clearly they've got a lot more than that.
Wow. When you're dealing with all the complications there on Capitol Hill and the politics behind it, it's good to have congressional correspondent Nancy Cordes to get us through it and make it as straightforward as possible. Thanks, Nancy.
Great to be with you, Errol.